We've all heard about the link between horseshoes and good luck. But did you know that back in the day, some people used to think that if they wore iron bracelets, it would stop incubi and succubi visiting them in their sleep? Yep, this week we are going to have a look at the really strange world of amulets and protective magic in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with our investigation, shall we say, of all things kind of protective and folk magic-y and so on. Clearly there's a lot to cover in these areas, so I am kind of doing the best I can to fit it in like 15 to 30 minutes depending on the episode. So way back at the start of February we had a look at apotropaic magic to do with houses. So that's the kind of practices that people would do to hopefully keep evil out of their house. And then last week we looked at things to do with how you use divination to find out who you were going to marry and all that kind of jazz. This week we're going back to sort of the protective thing, but I've also found that there's quite a lot of stuff just around generally attracting luck as well. And this is on like a personal level, so we'll be having a look at amulets and things that people would carry with them to try and attract luck or deter ill fortune or to gain some kind of protection and some such. And as I've said before, next week we are going to have a look at things around sort of the folklore of finance and wealth, as it were. So things that people would do to try and improve their finances or hang on to whatever money that they had. So that should be quite an interesting one as well. I haven't decided on the theme for March yet, so if you do have any requests, please do feel free to drop me a message and let me know. Obviously you can email me, and that's just icy@icysedgwick.com, or you can grab me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook even, whichever you fancy. Make it easy for yourselves. So we are just going to jump straight right in because I can't see the point in having a massive introduction. So as I say, we are looking at amulets this week, and we often talk about good luck charms, but I think if you've hung around in these parts with me for a while, you'll know that charms can also refer to written words as well, or spoken aloud words, whichever, and they're often quite easy to memorise and use when needed. So when we're talking about amulets, that's where I'm kind of using them to denote the physical object that you might be carrying, and that might be to bring you luck, it might be to protect you in some way, or it might be even just for a simple confidence boost, whatever it happens to be. And as I say, the common word for those is amulets. W.L. Hilberg describes an amulet as a material object that we keep to either divert disaster or attract a pleasing outcome. Now, it does need to do so by seemingly going against natural laws, so it has to have some kind of sense that it has some kind of magical properties, and keeping the object is essential to its protective value. So you do occasionally come across instructions, particularly on Pinterest, and I dare say probably on TikTok as well, for making such things, and they often have you destroying the thing for the charm to take effect. Nope, if you're going to have an amulet that's going to do a thing, you have to keep it in one piece. Now, Carol Czerny calls amulets, and I quote, part of the universal heritage, end quote, since so many cultures have used them over time. And if you do have a look at them online, you'll see that there are so many versions going back centuries in so many different parts of the world. Czerny does point out that the line between magic and rationality was more permeable in the 16th and 17th centuries, so while we may think that a belief in magical amulets is irrational now, this was not always the case. So if you look at the general instructions for use, you can wear amulets like pendants, you can carry them in a pocket. You do also have talismans as well, which are believed to bestow extra magical properties depending on what they were made for, but quite honestly, we're not going to get bogged down in the definitions, because if scholars haven't been able to pin down the difference between an amulet and a talisman in years of debating it, it's really unlikely I'm going to be able to do it in a single podcast episode. So what we are going to have a look at is the items that people carried or wore to protect themselves, which, as I say, does differ from the apotropaic magic that we looked at around the house, because this is amulets to protect the individual, not the home. Like I say, many cultures do still use amulets, and we're basically going to focus in this one on those in Europe. And I think we've all seen how quickly people will cling to misinformation in the face of medical disaster. And in the early modern period, it was no different. And obviously there is the podcast episode about plague folklore if you're interested. Cherney talks about medical amulets though, and they were, as you might imagine, designed to ward off the plague, but also other forms of illness as well. And one type used enchantments or prayers which came from folk magic, but they were often things that the bearer didn't actually understand. So they would go to a magical practitioner, they would make this amulet or whatever it was, and they would give it to them, but they wouldn't actually know what it was or how it worked or anything like that. There's another one, which is like a sealed container, which the person would carry around with them, the contents of which they weren't privy to, but they were strenuously told that they shouldn't open the container because if they did, the amulet would stop working. Now, to me, that kind of reminds me of years ago on eBay, somebody was selling a sealed can of Michael Schumacher's exhaust fumes. So obviously, if you tried to open the can, you would obviously then lose them, but then you could never prove what was actually in the can to start with as a result. So it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat, but for medicinal amulets and so on. And I just find that it is basically snake oil of the finest order, really, in all the wrong ways. But physicians disliked amulets for medicinal purposes, not because of the fact that they were basically ripping people off, but because they saw them as competition. So the physicians would decry the use of such amulets, whether they worked or not, to try and keep medical knowledge among themselves. Now, Cherney does relate a story that illustrates this perfectly. So in the early 16th century, a chap called Jan Dubravius was working in Pilsen, and a poor woman came to see him asking for an amulet against her high fever. Dubravius thought this was nonsense and tried to talk her out of her belief in the power of amulets. The woman was like, "No, I want my amulet, that's what's going to work, please can I have my amulet?" And Dubravius eventually wrote, "Beef usually makes a good broth in Czech" on a piece of paper. He folded it up, gave it to her, and away she went, quite happy that she had a cure. Some years later, Dubravius became Bishop of Olomouc and fell ill himself, and no physicians could apparently cure him. Eventually, someone told him about a woman in Pilsen whose amulet cured many people who had the same symptoms as him. Dubravius clearly had no concept of dramatic irony and borrowed this magical amulet himself. Lo and behold, he got better. So once he was well, the bishop wondered what magic this amulet could possibly hold, so he unfolded the paper, and yes, his own mocking words stared back at him. So 16th century doctors used this story as an example as to why amulets didn't and couldn't work, because to them Dubravius must have been cured by something else and the amulet was simply a coincidence. So if nothing else, it became a really good moral not to play tricks on people, lest they become played on you in turn. I should point out that there is a context behind this story based on the religious backgrounds of Dubravius and the writer who related the original incident, but it does still illustrate both the common belief in amulets and the medical disregard for the practice. I do think it says quite a lot that the woman would rather have an amulet than some kind of medicine in like the very early 1500s, but obviously we won't go into that in depth now. Now, in the early Middle Ages, the cross actually became the only accepted form of amulet, with Thomas Aquinas actually permitting them in the 13th century. But people persisted in using other amulets, as the Dubravius tale illustrates. And the use of some amulets does persist into the present day, even if people are only using them as a nod to tradition rather than actively believing in their magical properties. And one need only look at the association of horseshoes and good fortune or luck. Now, we have talked about horseshoes before, back when we looked at blacksmithing, and they do appear in a lot of the stories about blacksmiths, because if you think about it, in centuries past, the blacksmith trade looked a lot more like alchemy. They took this metal ore, they applied heat and pressure, and then created something else. And to be fair, as someone who has had a very brief go at blacksmithing, it is actually like some kind of weird magical thing that you put like an iron rod in fire essentially, and then you can turn it into a candlestick or something. It is pretty magical. But people usually associate horseshoes with weddings, no doubt due to the fact that they represent good luck. So on one hand, you've got them hanging up in the house to try and bring good fortune to the house and also deter evil spirits from entering, but then you've also got these associations with weddings. And Alex Spencer notes that in Scotland, the bride would carry a horseshoe in her bouquet to bring luck. Others might actually sew a silver horseshoe into her wedding dress down in the hem. And then in other places, it was actually customary for the flower girl to give the bride a silver-coloured horseshoe as she left the church. And people would sometimes even give horseshoes as a wedding gift. Now, the use of horseshoes as a protective item does make quite a lot of sense when you consider what they're made of, and that's obviously iron. So this metal has long been considered an anti-fairy metal, so if it can ward off fairies, it does kind of stand to reason that it would also be able to keep other negative entities at bay as well. And obviously, as we discovered in the Blacksmiths episode, St Dunstan apparently used horseshoes to bend the devil himself to his will. So you do also kind of have to wonder, would horseshoes also ward off a problematic would-be husband as well? Now, speaking of iron, people also wore iron bracelets in bed to try and protect themselves from visits by succubi or incubi during the night. Again, the use of iron here would provide some kind of protection from malign spirits. And the late Eric W. Edwards also relates a remedy recommended to deter demons. So girls who didn't want to lose their virtue to an incubus were directed to use herbal concoctions including St. John's wort, vervain and dill. Now these potions clearly weren't amulets, but they were still made with protective intentions in mind. Obviously, warding off demons is one thing. There's also a desire in most places to try and ward off disease of some description. And Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud note the superstition among working class Londoners of wearing blue beads. And according to the tradition, people would basically wear a string of blue beads around their neck and they'd put them on as children and then just never take them off. And the idea was that the beads would help ward off bronchitis. Now, if you wanted to protect yourself and your baby during pregnancy, you were advised to get hold of an eagle stone, and these are small brown hollow rocks, and because they're hollow, they've often got like pebbles or sand inside them, so they actually rattle when you shake them. And according to our old friend Pliny, they were only found in eagles' nests. So because the eagle stone seemed to be pregnant, hence the rattling, they then became amulets for pregnant women in that typical sort of use of sympathetic magic. So the advice actually directed women to wear them around the neck or around their left arm, and then it would basically mean that they could protect the health of their pregnancy, and it would just basically help with the whole process. If you do want to learn more about the folklore of eagles and other birds of prey, I do have an exclusive podcast episode all about them, which you can get access to if you become a Patreon supporter for $3.50 a month. But back to the actual topic at hand. And finally, for this episode at least, toothache in earlier times was, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, a persistent and painful problem. And we have looked at various ways that people used to use to try and get rid of toothache in the past, and they've all been horrible. But M.A. Denham actually collected a cure in Northern England in the 1840s, and I do say cure in inverted commas, and it started with reciting this little, it's called a rhyme, but it doesn't actually rhyme, but anyway. Peter was sitting on a marble stone, and Jesus passed by. Peter said, "My Lord, my God, how my tooth doth ache." Jesus said, "Peter, art whole, and whoever keeps these words for my sake shall never have the toothache. Amen." And for best results, people should actually write these words on a piece of paper and then wear it around their neck to ward off toothache. And to be fair, compared to some of the other things that people did, I'd probably far more inclined to do that one instead, but there we go. Now, not all amulets need to be worn, and we did obviously mention earlier in the episode the idea that you could carry them instead, and obviously pockets are one of the main ways that you would carry them. That is, of course, if you're lucky enough to actually have pockets on your clothing. But many people would actually keep equal armed crosses made from rowan twigs and red thread in their pockets, which obviously we've discussed the protective elements of rowan before. And there is a beautiful example of these on my blog from the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. And people would essentially use these to ward off both the evil eye and keep witches at bay as well, because obviously rowan is one of those woods that just witches can't apparently be anywhere near. Incidentally, carrying a sprig of rowan in your pocket randomly also allegedly protected against rheumatism, which seems like a bit of a strange combination. And if you carried conkers in a pocket, that would help you ward off arthritis. And even better, if you had 3 shiny conkers, carrying those would make sure you always had money. And if you needed luck, you could carry a bat bone in your pocket and that would apparently attract it. Not 100% sure where you get bat bones from. They're probably not on eBay, but this is indeed what the folklore says. If you're looking to attract luck in a much more easy way, then you could carry a piece of coal in your pocket. Now, obviously, granted, coal's probably not that easy to come by in most places, but if you can get hold of a piece, then just a little piece of that will apparently attract luck. There is an alternative, which I think this one is far easier to do. And what you do is you get a bottle of wine or champagne that you've opened for a special or significant occasion, and you keep the cork that came with the bottle. And what you need to do is cut a slit in the cork and then push a coin into it. And this basically then creates a simple good luck object that you would then carry around with you. There are, of course, some protective items which are a little harder to quantify because you don't wear them and you don't carry them, but you do need to keep them nearby. So one example would be bread, surprisingly. George Soane says in his particular collection from 1849 that you need to put a holy crust of bread under your children's pillow to keep night hags away while they sleep. I don't know if he actually means bread or communion wafers in this particular instance, but that is what the book says. You could also hang a stone with a hole in it known as a hag stone above your bed, which also, if you look through them, you're supposed to be able to see fairies and witches as well. But having one of these hag stones above your bed would guard you against being hag-ridden, whatever your age. Incidentally, as well, coming back to corks, if you suffer from cramp in your sleep quite a lot, the superstition says that you should put cork under your pillow and that would protect you from cramp in your sleep. Literally cannot work out what the link between those two things would be, but there you go, that's what the folklore says. In their Dictionary of English Folklore as well, Simpson and Roud also discuss the phenomenon of the charm wand, and these are quite pretty glass items that sometimes take the shape of rolling pins or walking sticks, and the glass might have a multicoloured twist inside, a bit like a marble, or sometimes they were hollow and people would actually fill them with coloured items like threads or beads, and people would use these wands for protection against the evil eye, and it would also protect them from illness as well. And if you then wiped it down every day, it would protect you from sickness. So obviously I want to find out a little bit more about these because it's quite a short entry in the dictionary. And I found Daniel Harm's blog and he discusses them having found one in the Wayside Museum in Cornwall, and the one he found takes the form of a walking stick which is made of glass and hung over the fireplace. And the idea is that anything that came down the chimney would end up so transfixed by counting the bubbles in the glass that they then wouldn't enter the home. And then the homeowner would wipe them off in the morning and burn the rag. So it's a bit of an interesting idea that at that point they actually become apotropaic magic. But then when George Soane describes them, he says that they're a peculiar superstition from Devon and that they were actually specifically used to draw disease away from the occupants of a house. So what you would essentially do is it would act like a magnet for disease and various maladies and infections and what have you. And you would then wipe it down in the morning to get rid of everything that had built up, and then it would be good to start collecting them again that particular day. So Harms does note that the breaking of a charm wand was a bad omen and misfortune or illness would surely follow. And it's kind of a bit of an odd one because there's so little about them available online. So I did have to more or less rely on Simpson's dictionary and Harms's blog post. But what sort of seemed to come out of it is the fact that it was more likely that people originally used these items as decorative ornaments and then they gained magical associations later. So if anyone knows any more about charm wands, please do feel free to let me know. If you've maybe got one, a family's got one, you've seen them on bargain hunt, whatever, just because it would be quite good to add a little bit more to the body of scholarship, as it were, about that. But that is basically the end of looking at these few different types of amulets. Obviously we can't do all of them because would be here literally forever, but I think the thing that fascinates me about amulets, and you don't get this with the apotropaic magic quite so much because I don't think that there are people going round inserting things into their walls and so on in the way that people did in years gone by, whereas we still use amulets of a sort. And we may not believe in the magical properties anymore, but I'm pretty sure most people probably have something like a favourite pendant or possibly even a watch that they always wear for job interviews because it always seems to bring them luck. Or they might have a particular thing that they always wear when they go on a date because it just makes them feel more confident. And really, we do tend to imbue objects that we own with meaning, so it is no surprise that we would continue to view certain items as being lucky. And obviously, it's a lot less likely that we're going to keep an item to protect us from harm or ward off witches. That is true. So I think a lot of people tend to have items more to bring them good things than to deter bad things. Although that said, perhaps our travel-sized bottles of hand sanitizer have become our newest protective amulets. Who knows? What I do want to know is, do you actually have any of these lucky objects? I kind of don't really necessarily think that I do, but I bet if I stopped to think about it, I'd probably think of something. I mean, like, for example, we've got the piece of coal that I take around the house. I mean, as in when I go out the back of the house and come in the front for first footing. So that's sort of like part of a tradition and also kind of an amulet to bring warmth into the house again. I don't know, it's a weird one, but basically I'd love to know if anybody has any of these, if they are family heirlooms, if they are things that you've just developed yourself, whatever it might be. Have you got like a lucky protective thing that you happen to have, or whatever it might be that you use it for? It will be brilliant to hear from you. So that's the end of this week's episode. Like I say, next week we're doing sort of attracting wealth and money and all that kind of jazz. So that'll be a nice end to February, I think. And if you do have any specific requests for March, please do let me know. The bonus episode for the Patreon supporters this month is going to be the Kaliak. So if you're interested in her as a figure, then obviously if you become a £3.50 a month supporter or more, then you'll get access to that. And without any further ado, I will see you next week when we'll have a look at the folklore of finance. So cheerio. Well, thank you for listening and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.